Okay, so this session is looking at the conference themes from the point of view of the peak bodies. So I've got on my panel here Bruce Callaghan, who is CEO of BCA National Training Group, but here as chair of ACPET. Elizabeth Moore, who is the Dean of School of Business, Australian Institute of Management, but here as a board member of the Council of Private Higher Education. Deborah Terry, who's VC of Curtin University, but here as a representative of Universities Australia. And Nicholas Hunt, who's CEO of William Angliss Institute, but here representing TAFE Directors Australia. Now, if I can start with you, Professor Terry. So we've already heard this morning that Glyn Davis has argued that the public universities are not very diverse, that they are all pretty big, none of them are specialised, they're all offering a wide range of disciplines, they all do teaching and research, they're commuter institutions. Is Glyn right, or is that concealing a large amount of diversity?
Thank you very much for the question. Can everyone hear me? And delighted to be part of this panel. I don't disagree with Glyn's statement at a high level, but I think underneath the apparent similarities, and I'm just now talking about the universities, I think we are seeing increasing levels of differentiation, increasing levels of diversity. You just need to look currently at some of the international student trends. We're seeing quite a lot of differences across the sector in terms of where international students, for instance, are choosing to study. If you have a look at our institutions, some of them, like Curtin University, have quite a significant offshore presence, and that's something that institutions are deciding that they want to prosecute as a strategy. I think there are big differences in terms of modes of delivery, focus on different cohorts of students. We've got some dual sector institutions. So underneath the lid, I think there is quite a lot of diversity. I think we need to celebrate and recognise that diversity more. I think we need to profile it among our institutions more in terms of when we go out and talk about different universities, making it clear where our diversity is. But we do all play to our different histories, our different cultures. Our missions, yes, at a high level are similar, but when we interpret those missions across our institutions, they are nuanced, and we are increasingly playing to those different nuances.
Do you think things like particularly the growth of international students in some of the eastern states is fundamentally changing the nature of the student experience there compared to, say, in Western Australia, where there are many fewer international students?
Well, that's a good plug for the session this afternoon on international student issues and demand. I think it means that the diversity and the shape of the student body is different. Whether the student experience is fundamentally different, I don't know, because I think our value proposition across all of our sectors, all of our institutions, is to ensure that we offer a diverse student experience wherever we are in the sector. But yes, we are seeing very different patterns of international student demand at the moment across the country.
Elizabeth Moore, could I go to you? We've had two private universities now with about 30 years of experience, University of Notre Dame in Western Australia and now in the eastern states as well, and Bond University in Queensland. Do you think they have been able to provide a distinctive student experience that is different from what the public universities are offering, or are there forces of homogenisation across the whole system that affect those two as well?
I think it's a bit of both, Andrew. I'm a great supporter of public higher education. It gave me my honours undergraduate, my PhD at UNSW, my grad dip at Central Queensland, and my masters at Deakin. And notwithstanding what the postgrad student yesterday inferred about arts graduates, I didn't get paid less. Was I less worthy? No, I think I made it to run three very, very important business schools and was DVC at 2 universities. So go humanities. And I am a STEAM rather than a STEM person. But in my almost 4 years now in the independent sector, I've seen what complementarity that can give to to the public sector that is called for by students, by employers, and a range of professional stakeholders. It's not an insignificant sector. 10%, over 1,200 different organisations, 150,000 students and growing. And indeed, Glyn Davis, in his recent book, called for a vibrant ensemble of competing visions. And I think you made the point that we're sort of getting there. I think there's an enormous way to go. And I think the reason for that is that in spite of the research, we're not very good at conceptualising diversity, nor indeed in measuring it. I think the other thing is that we are in fact wedded to simplistic dualisms, public versus private. More recently, profit, not for profit. And while that might be very comforting in many ways, I think it does a disservice to our critical intelligence and argument, and it feeds that very siloed and disruptive thing of status differences. And I think that is one thing that the AQF is also grappling with. We need to stop this siloing, and that universities are the best and everyone else is the worst. But for me, the key difference in the private sector, not just in the universities, and this is borne out by the two you mentioned, but also in the rest of the independent sector, is the student learning experience, and indeed the faculty who are academics, bring a wealth of professional experience, bring the war stories into the classroom in a way in which people who are aspiring to A+ journals, research grants can't always do. And that's where the complementarity, I think, resides. It's equal, but it's different. And the Quilt results demonstrate that. The independent sector comes out on top in teaching quality, student skills and student support. And interestingly, as we heard at the online workshop on Tuesday, the most numbers doing online are people in society and culture, surprisingly, not business. And in that sector, in the recent Quilt results, 3 out of the 10 top institutions, universities, were private, led by Divinity, Notre Dame and Bond. And so I think that demonstrates this complementarity, not competition, complementarity. I think it demonstrates a call for, if not a level playing field, but a more equitable approach to regulation and the encouragement of diversity, but of course always within the strong guidelines and threshold standards of TEXA. And I say that as an ex-ARCA auditor who led the audit of La Trobe Uni, and we have to have both. And if there's transparency in student engagement, there has to be transparency in regulation, which we've heard a lot about. Thank you.
Could I explore with the other panel members whether this public-private distinction is in fact making sense to us anymore, where the public universities are in fact quite dependent on private money these days, and certainly we've got TAFEs, which are public institutions, which are often just lumped in with the private higher education providers. So are these categories actually, do you agree with Elizabeth that these categories in some ways distracting us from the larger issues?
I would like to say something on that, if I may. I agree entirely that they're not useful concepts. The purpose of a learning institution, a university, is obviously to promote learning and provide access to our citizens so that they can use their skills in the future. Now, private, public, look, we'll continue to use it because it's convenient, but I think it's very lazy. And we need to step beyond it and start talking about what we're doing, not just in universities and higher ed, but how we're working across the whole university sector, because we're moving into a time when all of our knowledge needs to be reconceptualised according to whether we're theorising, reflecting, applying, and where we fit in that process. There's huge jumps to be made.
Any other views on that topic?
Well, I agree, because there is a sort of blurring of the boundaries, because the publics are looking to philanthropy and fundraising, while some of the independents are looking towards more government funding of students and services. So I think the blurring is there, but I agree, unless we honour the TAFEs and the vets, those of us who have PhDs and still can't turn on the television when it doesn't work, never mind all the more important things the TAFE and vet does. I mean, these are all complementary systems, and in fact the AQF has as one of its goals to make it a much more seamless system that does work together rather than does work in siloed departments competitively.
I think, Andrew, a way to express how we're struggling with different labels, everybody seems to like labels in education, is this is an annual conference by TEXA, and that first word is tertiary. But as soon as we move away from the landscape, we talk higher education, which is the purview of pretty much the predominant 40 universities. And so right there, you're starting to disaggregate what really is that tertiary education offer. And there are different ways it's not necessarily in the regulation, but there are different ways in the implementation of that, and how individuals outside making choices to go and pursue either further education or continuing education get confronted with differences between how we look at the sector. So it's probably incumbent on us to do more reflective work. We've got the word diversity as one of the themes within the conference, which is fantastic. But if you look at diversity in terms of how it's influencing choice of students by the various different policy and procedural rules that there are there, then we've got a fair bit of work to do, I think.
People are jumping the barriers already too. I mean, I think a lot of our conceptual work and the discussion you'll have here will be in terms of concepts that people are going beyond. I met a group of audiologists a week ago who are working with doctors and nurses in Aboriginal communities to try and properly address the early hearing problems in those universities. And what they're saying very clearly is that the medical and nursing training doesn't actually address that issue properly, and unless there is a sort of vocational contribution that enhances what those people are doing, then huge amounts of our medical expenditure in communities is simply wasted because we're missing the target group that self-evidently to those communities has to be addressed. So, you know, it's an exciting time, but to me and ACPET, really concerning that we're sort of lacking the intellectual horsepower to readdress our own system.
Is this something that Labor's big post-secondary review would address? That?
Well, it's been overtaken overnight by a Liberal review as well. They're coming in a chain, aren't they, cascading down on us. But I think what it is saying is we need to start thinking, and I'm not sure whether it's political. Obviously, we need the political will, but we need the academic reflection that gets outside the normal categories, which are not diverse. I think there is something of a complacency about higher ed that has to be challenged if we're going to address the future.
Well, and the inequities of punishing students who choose independence and then have to pay the inequitable fee help 25%, which also then previously was given to those in the private university sector, but then taken away, but kept for the rest of the independent sector. You can't punish people if we're going to have a seamless system for choosing what suits their purpose in life and what makes possible their transformation personally and career-wise.
So the other panel members agree that we've got 126 independent providers, but does that really amount to practical choice for students, given the funding constraints on them, that they have to pay a lot more to go to one of these providers compared to a public university?
But Andrew, I think it's cost is one point, and Elizabeth's talked about that, but it's also about the extent to which there are seamless pathways across different elements of the sector. And there's a lot of bureaucracy, as we know, in terms of each institution working, and I'm talking now about universities, working out particular articulation arrangements with particular parts of the vet sector or the private sector. That's the issue. I think there is one point, and Elizabeth's made it very clearly, around cost, but the other point is around these seamless pathways that will take students maybe from the vet sector to the university sector, and then for another qualification from the university sector into another part of the private sector or the vet sector, and that's what we haven't, I think, got good mechanisms to achieve at the moment.
But I think that relates to that issue of status, with universities there and the rest down there.
Absolutely.
And the fact that students are willing to pay extra says something about their really deep desire to have different but equal. And I think, you know, again, the AQF is trying to make that more seamless. And micro-credentials is a good example. It is a disruptor, not just for the university sector, but for the independent sector.
But there's also a bureaucracy.
Absolutely.
It is really difficult
Yeah.
for a student who's trying to navigate these seamless
Absolutely.
pathways
Yeah.
across very siloed parts of a larger sector, and I think that absolutely has to
Yeah.
be addressed.
The other thing, and I want to refer to the excellent talk from our first speaker today about regulation and the sector. It's again an anecdote. I was in Asia last week, and someone in Vietnam, a minister, said, "Why does Australia keep trashing its higher ed sector?" He said, "You're competing with Canada, Britain, Japan. We get students to Google Education Australia and they come up with 50-60% of people aren't compliant." It's not TEXA, by the way. 50-60% of providers aren't compliant on the day of assessment. Now, a student in Asia thinks, you know, this is a whole bunch of shonks. What it probably means
That's
is
a
that,
reference to vocational education, isn't it?
well,
Yeah.
it's I'm trying to see them as related.
As related, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yes, it is, though. I'm not taking the text thing on, but it does come to the point that we need regulation that is about continuous improvement and partnership in reality and working to a better sector and acknowledging the things that we do well as the things that we don't do well. And I think we've got a lot to learn on that process. No, I don't. Isn't that awful?
Reprogram it. Now, on this issue of the costs, in 2014, partly in response to a review I did with David Kemp, a previous minister put into the Parliament legislation that would have made the private higher education sector and the TAFEs eligible to go into the demand-driven system. Now, I want to explore sort of the tension between choice and diversity in the sense that was the danger in this for the providers that went in that they would go into a common funding and regulatory system will actually undermine the diversity of what they have. That really the funding rates for demand-driven funding were designed for a mass production university system, and it may be very hard to replicate the distinctive qualities of the independent sector on that funding rate. So was it a poisoned chalice? Anyone?
Anyway, I think diversity is, I think to give students a financially sound basis frees them up. And there should be equity on that basis. I believe that firmly. I think diversity is within what you're doing and within disciplines. I know we have lots of business studies, but it's how it's taught, what it does. We introduced a new unit on mindfulness and transformational leadership. And in the midst of the tragedy of the recent Melbourne shooting and the fire, one of the students wrote to the academic who designed and taught the course and said, "I was right at the touch point of that disaster. I went over and helped people who'd been injured. I firmly believe that if I hadn't done your course in mindfulness, I wouldn't have been able to cope." That's what we're on about. It's not whether you're doing business or maths or whatever it is. It is that transformative power. And I believe that is just as much the case in the independent sector as in the public. And students should be equally funded so that they can be free.
Andrew, the Business-Chancellor Australia report, Future Proof, I think, is one of the good pieces of work that really highlights some of the challenges in terms of having a level of equality across the choices for students in looking at what's ahead of them. We talk about the theory of the AQF, but when you actually go beyond that and you look at the level of support for students through either state or federal support, there's quite a vast difference at the vocational level, at diploma and advanced diploma, which is AQF 5 and 6, so it's the same in a higher education area. And so what that suggests to the market is there's different value propositions by our community through our government on these different forms of education. And I think there's a lot of work that could be done in trying to reduce that disparity at a procedural and policy point of view. And when you open the door and you start having the conversations, a lot of people point to the challenges within the vocational education sector and some of the shortcomings in relation to the VET student loan and the approach of a number of providers. Now, that's not the student's fault. That's a reflection on the inability of the process, the providers, the administration of those programs. And yet it seems to be the point too for a whole lot of reasons about what not to do in relation to supporting students. So for the non-traditional higher education providers who are in the market, those students are making a choice and they're paying a premium for that choice. They're paying a premium because they're not entitled to a Commonwealth supported place for many of the programs, and yet there's no shortage of students wishing to engage in that form of education because it either suits them or it's got a learning environment which is something that they're attuned to, so it reinforces that choice. But we seem to be wanting to tell them, no, that's not a good decision because as a community you'll get a contribution from a CSP if you go and study here. And if you come to a TAFE institution and you want to actually have a loan, the community through our government will say, well, we're going to tax you 25% for the privilege of taking a full fee paying offer and studying an alternative institution. And so it's by those procedural, administrative, perhaps bureaucratic positions that the Australian community has adopted through the policies we have at the moment that we're really, I think, not embracing this idea of diversity within a market. We're not embracing this idea of choice, or not embracing the idea that there might be some different education options for students, and that's where it suits them. But we effectively are charging them a premium to take an alternative option.
Andrew, I was just going to make the other point that we often are our own worst enemies. Even just wandering around over the last couple of days, you hear people say, yeah, and we're going to go for university college status, and we're nearly there, and all this sort of stuff. And I think, oh, wait a minute, do we all have to become universities? Let's look around the world. The top private institution in the world for management education, INSEAD, headquartered at Fontainebleau, Singapore and Dubai. It's the top, it beats many of the universities. It's not a university. The best place to go for entrepreneurship is Babson College. In Australia, the National Institute of Dramatic Art. I sat on its board, the privilege of sitting on its board for two terms. It is the best, and while it works with the University of New South Wales, it is not a university. Does being excellent mean you have to be a university?
Well, should it be easier to call yourself a university? So these institutions are already world famous. They don't need the term university to establish their credentials. But as we've made all the dominant players in Australia universities, is that now the word we use for higher education, and therefore it's a disadvantage not to be able to use it?
It is on the current procedural and bureaucratic settings, i.e. Commonwealth supported places and those other bits and pieces. If there was more of a consistent approach, then you might find diversity could be celebrated because that quest for university may not, that status from an access point of view and fee point of view might be changed totally.
I think we do distrust student choice bureaucratically too. I mean, there is a I think bureaucrats often deeply distrust citizens who might, if they're left to their own devices, make very unseemly decisions. And I think that gets deeper and deeper.
We have some bureaucrats in the room, so be careful.
Yeah, no, and I say it with great respect and hope that there may be some lights going on. But I think we don't really trust student choice, and it is true that these distinguished international national institutes are there because students worked it out and made a choice.
They didn't see.
In the future, students will, in a lifetime, make 20 choices, we all think. You know, they'll change career, they'll want a micro qualification, they'll do other stuff. Unless those choices are there, then our whole workforce descends to a different level. That, I think it's a very threatening thing that we have to somehow inform students and respect what they're doing, at a level anyway.
I want to move on to the theme of innovation. This is in the TEXA Act, and we've heard a couple of times that in this conference that particularly the independent providers don't really believe that TEXA encourages innovation, that because they have these standards which they have to enforce, these standards are informed by current practice and innovation departs from that. Is this a problem in practice? Can you give me examples of how it works?
Well, I'd like to just make a sort of a generic statement, and I think I attribute this to Maslow, and it is that if you only own a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail. And if you are a regulator, every problem has to emerge at some point in that situation as a regulatable issue, and that's not saying anything insulting. It's the nature of that kind of process. I think both regulators struggle with innovation. I think one more than the other, and it sort of is part of the nature of the beast. But I think the concept of continuous improvement and an openness to how we take the system from where it is to a new point can enrich the regulatory process and open new possibilities. So partnership is part of it, and mastering partnership is a new challenge.
We'll go to audience questions very shortly, but just
innovation. I think that's a very good question.
Yeah.
I think, and we've heard it this morning from Anthony, I mean, the necessity, risk and proportionality that, on which the TEXA Act is based, I think has not stifled innovation particularly, but I think, the report that's just come out from Deloitte does indicate perhaps there needs to be some more formal mechanisms by which institutions might be allowed to innovate and experiment, and mechanisms to trial some controlled innovations. I think that would be a good step forward. I think the case, and I'm now just talking from the universities, I think the case management structure has helped in terms of innovation, that we've been able to talk to case managers and say, well, this is what we're trialling, this is what we're thinking of doing. But as we also heard this morning, that structure needs to be strengthened, and we would support that. But I think the comments made in the Deloitte report are well taken. I think in the environment in which we're operating, where there are new sorts of credentials coming on board, I think having a more formal mechanism by which TEXA would support institutions trialling innovation would be a good thing.
I think it is problematic, especially for non-self-accrediting institutions. Levi calls it, I think, constructive isomorphism, in which people tend to try and become more rigid within the university system. And unfortunately, I think certainly Kofi hears many examples where innovations at one level are thought to be terrific, and when they filter down, there's a big stamp of no on it, and even when independents are trying to do what is allowed within the